Welcome to the London Free Press podcast. I'm your host, Rachel Gilbert. This podcast is typically being a rehash or maybe expansion on a lot of the stories that our reporters cover. But this week, this story is so big and so powerful that this episode will be sort of a companion piece. So I encourage you to go and read the story on lfpress.com that Randy Richmond wrote because he's been working on this story for several years and it reads like a book. It's about an hour read, but it's amazing, and it's called "The Boy with Two Names: A Scattered Family, a Nation's Shame, and a Death in Jail." Hi, Randy. How are you?
I'm good. How are you doing?
Good. This story, as I said, reads like a storybook. I'm sure you could write a whole book on this, truly. And you've been working on it for at least a couple of years. First of all, how did you even find this story?
Well, we learned back in 2021, in March 2021, there were three deaths that year at Elgin Middlesex Detention Center. And so when we hear about them, like every reporter, we try to get a hold of the family and or friends and find out what happened. So this name didn't come out right away. The name of Clayton Bissonnette, one of his two names, but I found out the name, and I found his sister, gave her a call, and she just said, "Well, there's a lot to this story." And she started telling me about how she and some of her siblings were part of the '60s scoop and how it was a split family and a reunion and all kinds of things. So we agreed right there on the spot that I would take a little more time. Didn't think it'd be a couple of years, but take a little more time to work on this story and listen to their stories. And then from there, just went to talking to other family members and going through records, things like that, to find more about the boy, the two names, Clayton Bissonnette and Danny Boy Armstrong, were his two names, and his family, especially three children who were the main characters, besides Danny, who were scooped up in the '60s and '70s and '80s.
Yeah. So this story follows a family over generations, and you found it obviously after Danny's death at Elgin Middlesex Detention Center. We traced Danny's family back to his mother, Mary Ellen, who also went by the name of Helen sometimes, and what her life looked like before she had children's. You go into her parents, her two husbands, and all of her children. She died tragically in Windsor. So let's kind of start there when Mary Ellen died. Or Mary Ellen, let's talk about her children first of all before she passed away. She passed away again in 1973, but let's start with her and what her life looked like and kind of how this all started to unravel.
Right, and Mary Ellen, I mean, a fascinating person, slight, described as beautiful, young Indigenous woman who grows up. The different documents, and you can't always tell what is the real story, what isn't. But you describe her as having some jobs, but she's growing up somewhere in a First Nations community or nearby, and she marries very young the first time, has children very young. Her first husband goes to jail, so she marries somebody else and has more children. And we it's not much education. We're not sure if she went to residential schools. The family suspects she might have. Certainly, she was part of that generation, and
Hmm.
certainly would have been affected by others around her that went, or if her own parents were there. And it's just an interesting life. She became almost mythical to the kids that didn't know her, in the sense that she was, small but tough and loyal and fierce, but also fell into alcoholism and stealing. Basically, almost lived on the streets in Windsor by the time she died. And at some point in her life, when she had a lot of kids, all of her children, she kind of left the family and wandered away, drifted. We're not sure how often she came back and forth, but they all had a connection with her, except for the ones who were scooped. Like Danny himself, you know, gave the graves bought a gravestone for her long after she died, and so there was always some sort of connection. So we don't know how fluid her relationship was with the kids, but a, a fascinating story. I mean, her roots go way back, Indigenous French Canadian, very very Canadian roots
Hmm.
uh, in sort of Northern Ontario. Yeah, fascinating person, and I wish I could have found out more about her, to tell you the truth. But if you look at the photographs, you just see this almost child when she had her
Yeah.
children.
Yeah. It's odd because through your story, you mentioned several times that there isn't a lot of information about her, and the information that we do have about the family and all their connections is very piecemeal. So there isn't, a strong history in this family because some of them have some information, some have others. The children didn't grow up together, a lot of them. And I found that interesting because a lot of us do have solid family histories that we can trace back, and maybe we take that for granted. In families like this, they don't have that, right?
Right, we use the word a lot through the story of a fragmented family and fragmented story, and it's
Yeah.
definitely true. I mean, there's so few photographs compared to, what we might have if our families stayed together. To have a photograph here and a story here and a kind of mythical story here, a couple documents. Some have documents, some don't. So they didn't grow up together. All of them. The ones I talked to did not grow up together. They don't have a lot of childhood photographs. They
Mhm.
don't have a lot of documents. And one of the main characters, Adrian, who was one of the three children who was scooped. She grew up with abuse, so spent a lifetime, fleeing abusive men. And when she fled, she just left everything behind. So,
Mm.
there's all kinds of things, records, photographs that, you know, lots of people would
Are
expect to
lost.
have and do have. Yeah, they're all gone. They're whatever. They're, blown into the wind somewhere.
Right. Let's talk about, the children because Mary Ellen had 9 children, and what happened to all of them? She didn't raise all of them.
No, she didn't. So she had the first set, and I always have to think about this because it gets kind of confusing. But she had the first set with a man named Simon Bissonnette. She had a second set with a man named Sam Armstrong. Sam Armstrong kept the Bissonnette kids and one of the Armstrong kids, one of his own, Danny. The other three Armstrong kids, Adrian, David, and Paul, they were put out for foster care and adoption, and it's not clear why. Maybe he didn't think they were his children. That's one family story. In any case, there's this basically an older set of siblings and a younger set with two different fathers. And the
Mhm.
younger set is what I focus on. The three that were scooped, Adrian, Paul, and David. As the story said, we don't want to recap it, but they took years, decades to find each other. And then, to their surprise, they found this other set of half siblings, and in the middle of the two was Danny, who was biologically the younger sibling, but lived with the older siblings. He was kind of that connection between the
Mhm.
two sides, and that really made him kind of key to all their lives.
Mhm. And so you follow all of the younger siblings from the second set in your story. And so now as adults, they found each other. How did they find each other? They didn't know about the other set of siblings, but they knew about one another. Is that right?
Eventually, yes, and Adrian, who she was always searching her whole life. She really wanted to find the other family. Paul was kind of ambivalent. David was, promised his adoptive mother, whom he loved, that he wouldn't go looking. But when she died, that he said that promise was broken. So he started looking. They all started looking, getting the same idea to find each other around the early 2000s, late 1990s. So they went to the official channels, the adoption services of Ontario, and they kind of got. First, they were all trying to find their parents, but their parents had died. But, to their credit, the adoption services said, "But you have siblings. Would you like to meet?" And so that led to emails and phone calls, and then a very nice reunion, but a bit
Mhm.
frightening because you don't know, as Adrian says, what if her brothers were bad people, right? If they were mean, what
Sure.
if they didn't like her? What if she didn't like them? All these questions, right? And so they had a meeting, and then Adrian and David just did a little more research, and to their surprise, found this other set. Um, which turns out not to be even the final set, as we find out later in the story. Their father actually immigrated from Ireland and left the whole family behind. A whole other branch of the story I could not get into. So yeah,
Yeah.
they found them and then they met them, and then it became a couple decades, the last couple decades of trying to figure out how you fit into all these brothers and sisters you never knew you had, and you know those of us who grew up with our brothers and sisters, it's still hard sometimes to fit in as adults, right?
Sure.
There's ups and downs
Absolutely.
in
Yeah.
relationships.
Yeah.
So they had that added layer of not growing up in the same household. not having the same family stories, right? And that
Mhm.
really made and makes it difficult.
A lot of the children who didn't grow up with, Mary Ellen and either of her husbands were in foster care. They were adopted by white families. Some of them had a great life. Some of them really had traumatic upbringing. Um, but you do have a thread of trauma for a lot of them in throughout your story, in different ways.
Right, and it's very interesting because let's just take the two of them, Adrian and David. So Adrian grows up in she describes it as a very abusive household. She couldn't wait to get away. She ran away a couple times. She tried to kill herself. She did things, just to get away all the time. She was sometimes sent to foster care and back. She calls herself like I was a bad kid at times. So she ends up, running away to Toronto, getting involved with bad men, horrible relationships. Her environment was not great for her. David's environment, he loved it. He had supportive parents, loving siblings. His siblings, I've looked up them, online, and they're, accomplished people. They stay in touch with him. But still, when he finds out he's adopted and he's indigenous and he's not who he thought he was, and all these, cultural layers and identity concerns, he ends up, stealing liquor and running away to Toronto and going to jail and basically down an even, parallel path with Adrian in the sense that he didn't,
Mhm.
he ended up being addicted on the streets of Toronto. He was homeless. So, it's difficult. I find it difficult. Like I don't, lots of us don't have problems about our identity,
Mhm.
but it's such a devastating thing to learn. Even you might have felt you're different and to find out, and so again, Adrian, bad environment for her, ends up on the streets. David, great environment, but the trauma still ends up on the streets, right? It's
Sure.
just goes to show you how devastating it can be.
Sure. Yeah. I was gonna mention the identity piece because all of the children have kind of mentioned that they struggled with their identity. They were indigenous, but some of them had an Irish father. Some of them grew up with white families. So, it sounds like they struggled and maybe still do with their identity. Like where I'm not purely indigenous, I'm not purely white. I'm kind of getting discrimination from all sides here.
Right. I mean, David talks about that a lot. That he kind of tries to play it as well as he can. He's a really he was a mayor for a while. He's a really gregarious guy. So for him, it's, well, I will be what you want me to be, or what's best for me at that moment. I'll be indigenous if I'm with indigenous people. I'll be white if I'm with white people. I'll be Irish, Canadian if I'm with white people, just to get along, just to
Mhm.
ease in. Adrian, is very committed to indigenous culture and spirituality. But even she says, "Well, it's just so hard in Canada these days." She goes to a ceremony and things like that, and she comes back saying, "I want to live in the woods and I want to live out the land." But she says, "Well, how
Right.
can I do that? I also want a paycheck and a nice house."
Sure.
Paul the third, he said, Paul is like, I'm comfortable where I am right now. I'm more white than indigenous, so I'm going to stay like that for now. And there's no right or wrong way. Each one is kind of trying to balance those parts of their identity as well as
Mhm.
they can, and it's very challenging for them.
Did any of them talk about being in residential schools, going to residential schools at all?
No, they were like the generation, so that they worry about their parents went to, but they were all more of the generation that was kind of scoop. So the residential schools were starting to be shut down. People recognized they were bad. So then the provinces took over child welfare and started, putting indigenous kids in so-called, good middle class white families. So they were more part of that.
Mhm.
Um, and if you look at, say, Marielle, and if that generation that went to residential schools or their parents, then they were trying to raise kids. So who were then scooped. It's just a mess. It's just a mess of family trauma.
Mhm.
Um, but they were all scooped. The 3 were scooped in the sense that they all were foster care and adopted. Some of the other ones in the older family were scooped now and then. Danny was scooped now and then, sent away. There's It's amazing stories. There's Danny's cousin told me that, there was a moment, I couldn't get into her because it wasn't her story, but, there were moments when child welfare was coming to the community and kids were hiding in trees and behind sheds and things like that because they did not wanna get scooped up. It's
Yeah.
horrifying stuff, right?
Yeah. And this can't be, we found this story because Danny eventually ended up in jail and died in jail of a suspected overdose, and we'll go into that a little bit more in a minute, but, um, there's gotta be other stories like this. The only reason we know this is because Danny died and you traced it back, but there's got to be, so many other families who have lived through the same horrors and traumas.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, the best estimate is 22,000
Mhm,
children were scooped up in the from the 60s to the 90s. And I
mhm,
talked to officials of organizations, people who had been scooped, and they had the similar, like they were all, everybody I was talking to, like they've all struggled with identity, some with substance abuse, some with relationship problems. So yeah, these stories on and on, and I don't think we hear enough about them. There are stories about the '60s scoop, but it's not that well known, really. I mean,
no,
it took Canadians a long time to learn about residential schools. This is
mhm,
to me like the next phase of our education as a country, how we have to
sure,
recognize what happened. And it was province by province, so it's kind of, there's not one big, bad guy here. There's like lots of different agencies, and in some cases, the agencies thought they were doing what they should be doing, and that's time at the time, right? Saving children, as they call it, even though it was like,
mm.
a horrible thing to do.
Yeah, yeah. Let's talk about Danny because Danny, who also goes by the name of Clayton, the boy with 2 names, was raised by his father and had a pretty good life and got was into drugs and alcohol, then got sober, then got hooked on prescription painkillers. Is that right?
Right. So it's hard because he didn't talk much about his life, even to his wife. But yes, he seemed to be doing fine. No one knows for sure. It sounds like he went to some sort of school or institution now and then, back and forth between his dad, but always came home to his dad, Sam Armstrong. And then there's a clue though that things weren't that great because when he was in his 30s, he started getting some drinking and driving charges. Then he met a woman named Tracy, and they got married, and she had 2 kids, and he settled down, and he was doing great, just great. They had a great life together. A good
Mhm.
guy, good father, good husband, hard worker. But so often in the early 2000s, he had an injury, fell off a ladder, and in those days, the quick solution by the pharmaceutical and medical community was prescription painkillers,
Mhm.
and he started taking Percocets, and then that led to the great wash of OxyContins that was being prescribed to everybody, highly addictive. He got addicted to that, and
Mhm.
then that broke apart his marriage. And then not many years later, he got caught drinking or driving while having prescription drugs in his system. Now, these drugs that were in his system were not illicit. He
Mhm.
was prescribed all of them, his lawyer says. It
Mhm.
sounds like there's a lot, which is also a problem, right? That maybe he's having too many. But he shouldn't have been driving, obviously, but he was driving with prescription drugs in his system. He gets in an accident right in front of a police cruiser, gets arrested, rightly so, and then goes to court. And in court, he took he got 120 days in jail. There's debate whether that was a proper sentence or not.
Right.
Of course, 120 days at London jail can be the worst thing that can happen to you. I mean, again, we've written about this before,
Yeah.
but you're sending highly addicted people to a place where there's lots of drugs. It's just illicit drugs, right? It's just not a great
Mhm.
place to be.
Mhm. And so Danny died in hospital in March of, was it 2021, of
Yeah.
suspected overdose, and typically in the media, when someone passes away, we are told their name, but in this case, it just said that an unnamed person died at the Elgin Middlesex Detention Center.
Right. And this is a problem in Ontario, and that, the chief coroner's office has identified, and the Canadian Civil Liberties Association has identified. Nobody tells us, the public, when someone dies in jail. There's no release, there's no report. It's just, it happens. And if it wasn't for family and friends tipping off reporters, I don't think we'd ever know. And so in
Mhm.
this case, the name just didn't come out,
Mm.
and just kept being, he was sort of the unnamed guy on the list. I know that there were some families of other inmates who knew his name,
Mhm.
And at one point, they put up a cross for him. Um, and they didn't know they spelled it incorrectly because they didn't know. Like nobody knew. He just is
Sure.
unnamed on the list. And so that's a big problem. I mean, there could be people dying any month, and unless a family member tells the media, we're never going to know about it. And
Right.
in this case, it kind of was really reflective of me of a lot of the problems. The fact that we didn't know who he was, and that I'm not sure anybody knew who he was um, that well because he kept so much hidden, right? And he kept so much hidden because of the horrible life he'd gone through.
Trauma, for sure. So that's kind of where your story began, and then you traced it back and back and back all the way to his mother, and this is how we learned about this family. Um, what can we learn from all of this? I mean, you've put so many hours into this story, years even. What can we learn from stories like this?
I think what I learned, I hope other people learn, is first of all, just the magnitude and devastation of what our country does and continues to do to Indigenous people. The story talks about the 60 scoop, and I hope it wakens people up for for the real life drama of what happened. And there's that old saying that a million people hurt or died is a statistic, but one is a tragedy. When you bring big events or waves of problems down to three or four people, it becomes more approachable, more significant to human beings somehow. And I hope that does that. I hope people
Mhm.
awaken to this. The need for us to recognize what happened, the need for the federal government to apologize about it, the need for perhaps better compensation, just all the concerns around 60s scoop and all the generational problems that are happening because now they call the millennial scoop. I mean, Indigenous kids are way overrepresented in our child welfare system in Canada and foster
Mhm.
care. It's more than half are
Mhm.
Indigenous, and it's again it brings us to the jail and the justice system, and we're failing people. We're failing Indigenous people, Black people, white people. We're failing everybody in our jail system in Ontario, especially. And media in London have been pounding on that door for a long time, and it slowly opens, but it needs a lot more of our attention because a lot of people just don't care, right? So I'm
Yeah.
hoping that people care and learn. I mean, I'm not expecting any great results from this story. I'm not expecting things to change overnight. I just hope it's one more
Mhm.
story that fuels Canadians' knowledge and awareness and perhaps change.
I think that's why it's important to publish stories like this and research them and find out more about these lives that even the people living them don't know all of the details about, right? So,
Yeah, absolutely. Like sometimes you just there's times that I thought, why am I telling this story? It's like, well, sometimes the story just deserves to be told because it's a story and that people deserve their voices. And they do.
absolutely.
This family, they were open and willing to talk to me and courageous, I thought, to
Mhm.
talk to me. So they deserve to be paid attention to.
Will there be more coming about this story? Are you investigating any other angles? Can we watch for more from you on this?
I'm not sure about that yet. I mean, I would love to learn more about the Irish family too and their
Sure.
immigrant story in Canada, right? I'd love to know more about everybody involved. I think I'll keep an eye on what happens with 60 Scoops Foundation and organization requests. Um, I have no plans now. Just let this one sit for a while and see what happens. But for sure, it's brought me into contact with many great people who focus on this issue. So I hope I can keep working on that.
Yes, and, I encourage anyone, listening or watching this to go and read Randy's story at lfpress.com, called The Boy with Two Names. Thank you so much, Randy, for being with us today. We will absolutely follow up with you when we, get something else from you. Thank you.
Thank you.